Andrew Glazer, thank you so much for being here, sir. Oh, I think you're still muted there.
There we go. Sorry, I should know by now.
All good. Yeah, no, we still forget. A year and
Yeah, it should be reflex. Anyway, thanks for watching my movie, everyone. I really appreciate it.
yeah, thanks for bringing it here. So let's start. Just walk me through like kind of the. I see that filming ended right around when COVID started, it seems, but walk me through that schedule of kind of like how this timeline unfolded.
Yeah, well, I actually reached out to the team in October of 2018. That was when I first learned of the team and that they were coming back to the border or back to the binational um, scheme. And we started filming the spring of 2019 and wrapped that fall, the fall of 2019. So we pretty much had production, thank God, finished a good year before COVID hit. We were in the edit when it came.
And did Showtime fund this from the get go, or did that come sort of later? Like,
So it's kind of both. They were interested from the get-go, but they didn't actually commit and give us money until about 6 weeks or 8 weeks into filming. So we
well, that's
were.
inconvenient.
It was inconvenient and a little scary. I had to take their word for it. But we kept filming, and we had a very lean crew, and kept doing it. And then, as we got more funding, we were able to get sound recordist and kind of amp up the production value a little bit. A second camera for the last couple shoots. But until then we were kind of bootstrapping it and taking a big risk in filming it.
How big was the crew? It seemed pretty limited based on just the credits.
Yeah, it was small. I mean, we had typically it was four of us in the field at a time, sometimes fewer. Sometimes it was just two of us. For the first 6 weeks or so, it was just me and a camera person, and then I was able to hire a producer and another camera person. And sound. But we would often split up into different units because it was the kind of film that we thought there was a value to having a very small footprint when we were with these guys moving about. And also it's just in parts of Mexico, particularly in Nuevo Laredo, it's not, you don't really want to stand out too much. And so that was also part of it, is to just be under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Nuevo Laredo because one of the things that struck me, it's really interesting because on one hand, uh, there's this clear voice in the film of how detrimental the wall is specifically to this community, right? And yet, there's a lot of depictions of violence in Nuevo Laredo, and a lot of sentiment among the people that are on camera, and also sort of almost inadvertently alluded to by players. I think at the end, like Luis Flores is like, "Oh, look at the wall, it's nice," right? And so you sort of indicate that he's really in favor of this. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about the, I guess, for lack of a better term, almost the politics of representation there,
Yeah.
of wanting to do that balance of representing realistically, and then also kind of taking into account that that sort of representation is very much part of the narrative of Trump's rhetoric in some way, you know?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple uh, facts that are kind of indisputable that may contradict the kind of political motivations for wherever people stand on the issue of wall versus no wall, or hardened borders versus softer borders. Um, so the facts are that Nuevo Laredo is an extremely dangerous place, and it has been for about 15 years. The reason is that it is a disputed turf for drugs coming into the United States. We love our drugs, and Nuevo Laredo is the last stop before they get to the US after having traveled from South America through Central America. So there's a big value for the cartels to control that place. And for that reason, they're constantly fighting over for that control. And disempowering media and government and police. They really run things, and it's very clear. It's sometimes it's not. Sometimes things are quiet. When we began filming it, we kind of got probably a little naively um, hubristic in traveling around with cameras and taking taxis home to Texas really late at night, which we learned later was not good idea at all. So anyway, that's fact number one, is that it's an extremely dangerous place, and largely because we demand drugs that come from South America and need to get through that border. Fact number two is that there is no border wall yet in Laredo, and there's also Laredo itself is one of the safest cities in America per capita. Um, by all the metrics that are used to determine that murder rate per capita, and even lesser crimes. Um, so the question is, does a wall stop? So there's danger there in Nuevo Laredo. There's not danger in Laredo. There's a natural barrier. And the people that tend to be crossing over illegally are the people that we showed on camera, their families, and individuals who are fleeing the very violence that is going on in Nuevo Laredo and south of there. So I think that we wanted to show, we obviously didn't want to shape the reality to support one political view or another. We wanted to show the way, you call it like we saw it, and show what we saw. And that's essentially it. I think the wall, I really like Trisha's portrayal or her description of what a wall is, that it's closing us in. I mean, historically, and it remains to this day, the ties between the two cities are, really deep, by whether it's family, language, food, culture, economics, and until very recent history, people would go back and forth with ease, and that's the way it was. And the drugs and the bad guys who bring in the drugs would often pass through legally. Most of the narcotics and the black market and the human smuggling, which is different than the people who are the families that are sneaking across, but people who are being driven across by the cartels are going through the legal entry points. And so the wall would really have little impact on that, if that's what it's designed for. So I don't know if I answered your question,
No,
but
you absolutely did. I mean, and it is a complicated question on some level. I think, narratively speaking, that is always something that plays into it, is how are you choosing to handle sort of the loaded politics of something. And it was interesting. I think that's what struck me about it. Was it was interesting on one hand of like there was a really clear narrative you're appealing to, but I think what struck me as well was really how removed the baseball scene appeared from it. Was there a lot of chatter about that off camera almost, or was it as sort of apathetic as it seemed in some way?
yeah, no. So are you asking specifically if the players weighed in on politics,
Yeah,
or?
exactly. I mean, there was
So,
clearly the moment leading up to like, are we going to have a season? Like that was a
right.
very clear political moment. But
Yeah.
otherwise, there wasn't a lot of mention of like Trump or ICE or Border Patrol or any of that kind of stuff in an explicit way.
You're right. And the players themselves were not overtly political. I think Juan Martinez was the most, but not from a political. He didn't, he kind of would talk about Trump and laugh at some of the stuff Trump says. And he was clearly extremely affected by the El Paso massacre, which arguably, was, if not, the match was lit by, or the fuel was there for the match, the fire that was lit by the political environment we were in at the time. At least
Yeah.
that's what I believe. So and the reason was Martinez. When the reason why I liked Martinez so much as a character was that his parents emigrated from Mexico, and he himself grew up, as the child of immigrants who spoke Spanish only for until he got to kindergarten. So I thought so in general, baseball players, at least the baseball players on this team, were not involved politically, which is why we wanted to. Although they were passing through daily the heart of this story that was going on, and I don't really blame them for not being. I think you use the word apathetic. I think, these are young people who are completely focused on their careers at that point. And It's, extremely grueling season. They played over 120 games and they were traveling sometimes 17 hours by bus, and then having to get off the bus and cross the border. So yes, there's a lot of time to sit and talk on the bus, but most of the time they were drinking beer and sleeping. So they were not hugely politically engaged.
You just mentioned sort of the grueling schedule, and obviously, that's part of any professional sports kind of environment. I think it's especially difficult when you're paid as little as you are in the minor leagues, and that you sort of show that as well. Um, and to that extent, there really are sort of two parallel narratives going on. There's like this sports documentary, and then there's this more sort of political documentary about what's going on with the activist community along that border. Um, can you talk a little bit more about decisions about balancing that narrative? And I'd be curious about hearing of it from an editing perspective of when you got there, but also like in either pre-production or production, like the design perspective of how you chose of what you wanted to capture in those stories.
Yeah, so I mean, really, we didn't know obviously what was going to happen, because it's a documentary. But we knew that something was going to happen with the team, because there's a natural narrative arc in sports. That's what's kind of nice about it, and it was contained. And what we liked about the team, which I, kind of incidentally learned about, was again that they were literally physically passing through what at the time was the biggest story in our country, I think.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's what propelled Trump to office, and everything that followed was really on the back of, his rhetoric and people's feelings about what was going on at the border, and whether it was a threat or whether it was, a human rights issue. That was how you voted, is how you interpreted that. So we wanted some of that context, the kind of wider picture, to help tell that story. And that's also why, and I've gotten some criticism, arguably, and I think understandably, that we had a little too much of Trump's voice in there. And I think criticism comes because literally the film aired in his, one of his last months in office, and we were all had heard that stuff. But I wanted to pick stuff that he was saying contemporaneously, largely, not always, but most of the time, what you were hearing him say was corresponded with where we were in the baseball season, and what was going on in the activist community and with the immigrants that you saw. And we wanted to weave them all together. And my intent was, not the way, CNN or the Washington Post fact checks Trump, but we wanted to really bring people to this place that everyone was talking about and hearing about, particularly in Washington, and show them how there was a dissonance between what was being said and the policies that were predicated on those assessments, and what we saw, and what the reality I saw was.
I'm glad you mentioned the thing about Trump's voice. I actually had that thought during it of like, God, how exhausting must this have been to like just comb through all that Trump audio. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, a lot, again, we were kind of constrained. Yes, it was exhausting, particularly because, again, we had heard it for not 4 years, 5 years, because it really started during the campaign,
yeah.
maybe 6 years. Um, so we were somewhat constrained because, again, oftentimes, most of the time, we were looking for his statements that corresponded with the timeline that we were working with, so we could really have these three narratives running along parallel. And again, my goal personally as a filmmaker here was to show um, the dissonance between the way it was being talked about and the reality. And he's talking about drug dealers and rapists, and really overwhelmingly the data shows that most of the people who were coming over were families who were fleeing those people that he was talking about. And we could show that.
And I do think it is an interesting thing of sort of organizing it temporally as opposed to sort of thematically between those different snippets. I mean, there's clearly thematic moments. I think there was the one of Trump's line about asylum seekers, and he's talking about the classic thing of like imitating some big hulking scary person and then having that image of them that's a clear of the family crossing, that's a clear
Yeah.
thematic link you're making, but otherwise sort of grounding it temporally is really this interesting thing where yes, like you're saying, it's showing three parallel stories, but it also kind of highlights, on one hand, the disconnect between Trump's rhetoric and the reality, and also I think the players disconnect from it. Of here they are focusing on this season and dealing with these really deeply personal issues to them.
Yes, I think that's true. And also, I mean, this is a little bit of an aside, but we were talking about the dangers of Nuevo Laredo. What we did want to show was that the stadium itself was kind of an escape. There was never any threat there. It was right in the middle of the city, so it was not like in some sort of idyllic suburb. It was right there. But and there was, yes, patrols of guys with guns. Sometimes they were police, sometimes military, and sometimes probably cartel guys. It's hard to tell. But within the stadium, you could forget that you were in a place that, at times has rivaled Syria and Iraq for the, level of violence. So that was something we wanted to show as well. And yes, the players and even the fans in those cases were able to kind of dodge the politics of the time.
You had mentioned a few moments ago, one of the, I guess it sounds like it was a criticism you received, was that there was like too much of Trump's voice, which I
Yeah.
certainly could understand. It could just be the trauma of his voice. Like, I get that. Like, people are just
Yeah.
like, it's triggering. It is. But it makes me wonder, I guess, I guess the best way to ask it is kind of what is some type of feedback, whether positive or negative, you have received, or just anything that has changed since you finished the documentary, that has sort of changed your thinking about it, if at all, or reinforced your thinking about how you presented something.
I think the network Showtime, which aired it, had concerns that it was going to be stale by air date, which was October. Um, I always thought, and now that Trump is gone and the border wall is frozen, um, I still think that it is not stale, and maybe I'm holding on to something because I spent so much time on this, but. I think documentaries can be a snapshot of this moment in time, and this was what was happening, and it certainly was, writ large. The immigration border issue during Trump's administration is something that we are all going to be talking about and looking at for many years to come, and I hope that this is part of the conversation. So, um, again, I understood, but I have spent most of my adult life as a journalist where we were very concerned about, um, the timeliness and the news, scoop and getting it out there, and also removing any sense of point of view, which was something that I was trained to do. And this was kind of my first um, film that first time where I had the ability to not do that. I had something I wanted to say, and I said it, and so that was new for me. Again, as a straight journalist, which is what I did for 20 plus years, you always have something to say. That's what you're doing, but it's not you. It's you're trying to report what happened and your interpretation. You're trying to show all sides of an issue. In this case, again, I had a point I wanted to make, and I made it as the best I could with what we had.
I want to focus a little bit more on that background in journalism. The first question that comes to mind is kind of what obligations maybe you felt that were tied to those roots that you carried into this film?
I mean, I think the editing, I just kind of the not creating reality in the edit that I really was, whether it's sound bites or chronology, I am pretty orthodox about playing by the journalistic rules of doing that. Again, we have Trump's voice, which obviously wasn't in that moment, but there are ways that I think there are gradations of manipulation of time and the sound the characters the words the characters speak that some documentary filmmakers are more comfortable going further with that than and I'm pretty orthodox about that. So just from a technical standpoint, that's one thing. But I did feel liberated not needing to do the on the one hand, on the other hand. Now, obviously, we had characters who had different points of view, um, but that was my choice. It was someone, I found that the cop, Mario Reyes, what I liked about him was he, again, grew up there, lived there. He was Mexican American, and he had um, a relatively sympathetic view towards Trump and his wall. Um, to me, that was an interesting voice to have in there. I didn't do it kind of as a desultory um, counterpoint. It was someone who I came across who was in the middle of the story, and I thought had an interesting point of view that defied um, kind of what we would think would be his point of view, or at least what I would have thought. And now there's a lot of postmortem on, how Mexican Americans along the border voted more for Trump than anyone expected. But that was my, you know, what I thought going into it, that this guy is pretty interesting. Just like the white ranch owner who reflexively one would assume would be a Trump supporter because he owns lots of land on the border. There are people, migrants crossing his property, but he had a very different kind of point of view. Um, so yeah, I think just being kind of freed, being able to have a thesis, that was my personal view, and use that to propel how the story was told was very different than what I had done in the past.
Can you say a little more about the casting process of it? Just mentioned Deputy Reyes and then the farmer. Maybe just saying a little more about a how you discovered them, and I'm especially interested for Deputy Reyes, the decision about how much screen time to allocate to him in some
Yeah.
way. He's a really interesting character, but obviously there are limitations in terms of relevance to the story. So I'd love to hear more on both those things.
Yeah, so I met him because he rolled up on me when I was filming next to the bridge late at night, and we were just filming some scenic shots, and we looked suspicious. We had a big Jeep, and he rolled up and started asking me questions, and then we talked for a while, and he asked if we wanted to ride along one night, and so we said yes, and um, we thought he provided kind of good natural context as someone who is literally, they're charged with enforcing Trump's policies. So that's how I met him. In general, the casting was hard because, or the casting was done largely on the fly with the team. So, for example, I got there in for spring training for just a week because I had a very small budget because Showtime hadn't thrown down yet. Um, so I got landed on the ground. I needed to get to know these guys. We needed to film kind of the beginning of the story. But we didn't really know who was going to be on the team until we got there because that's the way sports are. People get cut. And so and I only had one camera person. So it wasn't like I could have 6 camera crews out filming, lots of different people and let's figure out who the best are. So as I got to know people and as we kind of floated around from character to character, I started to kind of hone in on a long list of characters who I thought represented um, different facets of the team. We wanted some Mexican-born players. We wanted some U.S.-born players. I liked that both Flores and Martinez and most of the U.S.-born players were of Mexican descent, or actually not only Mexican descent but Latino. Um, and I liked that these guys kind of lived on the border or had, I guess Martinez didn't live on the border, but his parents crossed over, and Flores lived on the border. So they kind of were the embodiment of this kind of oozing of culture and very kind of American immigrant story. And then Trisha, we found late. We wanted to have, frankly, some women in the piece. We didn't have, there's none on the baseball team, and we wanted, I was looking for someone who could kind of again bring us into the greater context. And we spent some time with a nun who was interested in doing kind of immigrant outreach stuff, and Trisha and a couple other activists. And I thought she had the kind of most forward motion in her story. They had a plan, something they wanted to do, stop the wall, and she was, mustering the troops to do that. So she kind of fell into our film naturally.
So it sounds like there were a few other characters that who kind of fell off at some point. Like you had.
Yeah, there were a few that fell off, and one character actually fell off he was actually edited in and then edited out near the end. He was a character whose story I found extremely interesting, and he was very high profile. He was a pitcher on the team. His name pops up during one of the bridge crossings. His name is Luke Heimlich. He had a really interesting and tragic story. He was one of the top um, recruits out of college. He pitched at OSU, and every major league team was interested in signing him. He was going to get picked really early, and then right before the major league draft, it was found that he had pleaded guilty as a teenager to molesting a young relative. There's questions as to whether he pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, but he did, and there was enough questions. No one really knows what happened, and I wasn't going to investigate it in this film. And we had his story in there, and it was pretty far afield from the rest of the stuff. It kind of is its own documentary. So there was, some back and forth between me and my edit team, and then who actually we were on the same page ultimately after kind of putting it through the test, and then Showtime wasn't so thrilled with that storyline, and so he got pulled out of it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can see, especially just there are already enough controversial issues to tackle in it. Having an accused child molester on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of muddies the waters. His role in the film was kind of the fish out of water guy, which made him sympathetic until you knew there was too many kind of push and pull there. It was challenging, and again, it wasn't the film to kind of investigate what really happened, and so that got cut.
I want to invite our audience to ask some questions. I see we have one in so far. If any of you have questions to ask, just type them in the Q&A box. And like always, I'll invite you up to the panel to ask your question directly. You can turn on your video or not. Or if you don't want me to do that, you can just say so when asking your question, and I won't do that. But while we wait for a few others, I guess the question that I was on before is we were talking about the editing process. So that you mentioned that one character, that's one way that the story changed. You had this guy that you'd sort of written in some way, and then he disappears. I think one of the things that's really interesting about documentaries is obviously more than any other version of filmmaking, it's really written in the editing room a lot of the time. But I think what makes that really unique is you can actually discover a new story in ways that you don't always in narrative filmmaking, stories that you didn't even realize while you were filming it. Was there anything like that that you recognized about your film in a way that hadn't occurred to you prior to starting the editing process?
It's a very good question. I don't have I don't want everyone to sit here and wait for me to come up with an answer. Let me store that in the back, and I'll try to answer it later. But it's a great question, um, and I don't have an obvious answer
That's
at the
okay.
moment. Yeah,
Well, if you think of it, just come back to me with it. In the
yeah.
meantime, we'll go to Raj. Where's my little panel thing? Okay, so Raj, I'm looking you up now, and I'm gonna promote you to panelist. And as always, when you get on here, you can turn on your camera and ask your question directly.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you for showing excellent film. Really enjoyed your film.
Thank you.
How difficult it was to show to take your camera crew in Mexico area?
So the most difficult, the only place where we had challenges was in Nuevo Laredo. Most of Mexico, I mean, there's a lot of violence and a lot of scary stuff in Mexico, but it's not everywhere. So the only places that we really, I mean, Oaxaca, was super fun, no problems there. Mexico City, no problem. It was really Nuevo Laredo is one of the more dangerous places in Mexico, if not the world. And this is going to sound funny, but there are certain parts of Mexico where the cartels are almost camera friendly. If you arrange in advance, you don't show up with a camera. But the Sinaloa cartel in Sinaloa, I know lots of people who have filmed them, and they're fine with it. The cartel in Nuevo Laredo is the opposite. They don't want to be filmed at all, and you can see that brief encounter where my feet are shown because the cameraman, the lookout came running over and told us to stop. It can be really dangerous. Reporters, lots and lots of journalists, television crews are killed in Nuevo Laredo. So it was always, in the beginning, we were, again, because of budget and because of stupidity, and I've done a lot of international and conflict zone reporting, and usually I'm more careful. In this case, we were walking across with our cameras and then hopping a public taxi. Turns out a lot of the taxis were lookouts for the cartels. We would take the taxi to the stadium, and then things started getting more dangerous. That was in the beginning of filming. There was not really any danger or any overt danger in the city, but then things picked up. The state police came in to crack down, and then the cartels got anxious and started doing patrols, and we got chased and a couple times in our car by guys in jeeps with guns, and so it was very challenging in Nuevo Laredo.
Also, I love to see USC memorabilia on the wall too, while in the kids interview. That was a very interesting to see that some of our USC in the backgrounds on the wall.
I don't think I noticed that.
Yeah, I did notice that. That's it. Also, I have a couple of questions more. Will you agree with me, because your film subject is, as Matthew discussed, that it's a both the way, politically and social, both ways. Is it the more important building the wall? Your government need to control the inflow of the drug coming in from Mexico? That's one question. And the second question is, you being a investigating top-notch journalist, what is you would like to send the message after Trump is out on this subject?
Well, so the wall, I think, I don't know any expert who believes the wall would actually stop the flow of people or drugs. Most drugs come in through the legal ports of entry, and that's empirically proven. And even, we've seen these pictures of people slingshotting drugs over the wall anyway. So I always saw the wall as a rhetorical, a very expensive and very destructive rhetorical message, as opposed to a functioning deterrent. And I guess that answers question 2 as well. What was really disturbing for me, as I'm married to a daughter of immigrants. My great grandparents were immigrants. All who fled places, for whether it's for danger or for economic security. One of the things that was particularly disheartening was when, and this was during filming, when Trump instituted the Remain in Mexico policy, where people who by international law are supposed to be able to present themselves at the border and say, I'm fleeing persecution, and then they are entered into the asylum process. And the fact that they were prohibited from doing that, and we saw, we didn't make it in the film, but we went to a shelter in Nuevo Laredo that was filled with people who had, fled, from as far as Western Africa and Central America, made it there, and they're not even allowed to come and present themselves, as asylees. So I guess the overall message is hopefully that's over, and we return to being a country that is a safe haven for, people. We're a nation of immigrants because we've always opened our doors to people who are looking for safety and security, and hopefully that's what we are again.
Thank you. While filming, you never noticed that the water comes underneath the river on the wall because the drugs inflow with the overflow, or I don't know, they allow the water to come from the Mexico in certain way to keep the river and all. I read the article about such kind of drug coming in a different way, and the scientists and all, what they are testing the water that was the reason the lady was also checking pH.
No, she was just checking for environmental reasons. It's really, it's an extremely important waterway it's the source of water for people on both sides of the border, and if it's polluted, it's big problems, and it's also ecologically important.
Thank you very much for sharing your film. Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Raj.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right, next up, let's see, we have Fred Lawler coming up next. While I bring him up, I'll read this question from Alex A, who asks, how did you know when to end the film, and was there anything that you wanted to include that you learned after the film locked?
Yeah, so another good question. I think I did this on purpose. I mean, what I liked, so I wanted to do a border film. I didn't know it was going to be about a baseball team. I was infuriated and disgusted by what was going on on the border, and I was looking for a way in. And when I read, actually, it was a New Yorker article about a musician who plays along the border, and just in a paragraph in that article, the writer Nick Baumgarten went with the musician to a Tecos game. So it was just a passing mention, and it said that they were going to begin playing on both sides. And I said, oh, that's it. So by having a baseball team, there was a logical beginning, middle, and end spine of the story. Of course, we went, afield of the team, but the team itself had a finite season, and so that was basically the time constraint that we set. There was so much going on, and we could have obviously kept going, but the end of the season kind of marked the end of filming, with some hiccups, but that was the end of the film. And that was always going to be that way.
All right, Fred, I'm gonna, oops. I just said talking permit. I meant to actually allow you to turn on your camera if you wanted to. Hold on. Let me try doing it this way. There we go. All right. Fred, you should be able to turn on camera now. Oh, you've disappeared entirely. Okay. Well then. Okay, well, I hope that wasn't my fault. And he just left. He was asking sort of about the role of he said, surprising that Catholic Church was cited not more often in movie. I guess he's asking kind of about the role of the Catholic Church within that. Oh, here he is.
Fred's back,
He's
yeah.
back. Fred, if you can hear us, we see you on the panel now. You're welcome to turn on your mic and camera if you want to ask your question or clarify it. Are you there, Fred? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Oh, is that better?
Yeah,
Yeah,
now
I
I
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for a good film. Thanks, Matt. I saw some references and citations of the Catholic Church, Andrew, during the course of the movie. Did you see much of an influence of them down there, and was that on purpose, or could you comment on that?
Sure. The Catholic Church ran that shelter. Catholic Charities ran that shelter in Laredo. I believe that was the only. It was the only large shelter that I was aware of in Laredo, and that's why we selected them. It wasn't because they were the church, and I was not aware of any overt kind of religious role. It was mostly Catholic Charities does good works around the world, and this seemed to be one of them. And the guy that we briefly show on camera who ran that shelter was really a kind of a hero. He was in the beginning for the first several months of the influx of migrants, and these were migrants who were all being released from detention. The way it kind of, he didn't plan to set up the shelter. What happened was after a couple of days of detention, CBP would just drop these migrants off at the Greyhound station, and they had no idea what the fuck to do with themselves. So the Catholic Church came in and started, said, let's take them in, and suddenly they were running a shelter. And then at the end, where we showed the empty halls, that was because Remain in Mexico had been so enforced that there were no more migrants. So at a time there were hundreds, I think 500 up to 500 migrants passing through a day. Obviously not all staying there, but they would pass through and many would stay there. And near the end there were none, and it wasn't because there were no more migrants arriving, it was because they weren't able to come into the US anymore.
Wow.
Thanks, Fred. Did you notice, Andrew, a tension kind of between the Catholic Church and immigration officials? I saw it kind of alluded to in some way.
I think certainly, well, so it's interesting. Definitely there was, I don't think anyone really held the individual agents accountable. So there's a move between the policy that says these agents who are neighbors. In fact, CBP is a huge employer in Laredo, which is why they had that night at the stadium. So it is, the individuals who work there, there's almost a disconnect where I never heard anyone say, God, that agent is a jerk. Why is he doing this? It was always the critics of it, including the guy who ran that shelter, was, how can they be doing this? They're detaining families, they're detaining kids. So it was never, and then there was some tension where actually, once we began filming there, the CBP guys told the shelter guy to not allow us to film them anymore, and he told us, and we didn't listen because it was, we were outside and had a right to do that. They're government officials. So he, I think he had to work with them. It's better that the CBP guys were bringing them to the shelter than leaving them in the Greyhound station. I think they had a kind of an alliance there at some, or working relationship. But there's, definitely, have probably at root an adversarial relationship.
I feel like there are these iconic images that will always be burned into my mind of those migrant camps that were along the border.
Yeah.
That I actually can't remember if technically ICE oversaw them or if it was CBD that oversaw them, like which group did. I think it was ICE. And it's again, like, I think that's something that's alluded to in the conversation with the migrants during that sort of the organization that the Catholic Church is sort of hosting.
Yeah.
But I don't think there were any real like images of that specifically. It was kind of a little removed from the narrative.
Yeah, so you can't film. So these people actually, what they were talking about, the people in our film were talking about the detention, the ICE detention. These weren't the camps, which, or I don't know. There's camps that are in Mexico that are kind of just, for lack of a better word, now homeless encampments that are people who traveled all the way to the border and can't get across, are just waiting for their number to be called. They were letting a handful of asylum applicants in. So what they were describing was the detention centers, where you heard of, people talking about the freezers and the kids in cages. That's what they were talking about. And we, as much as I would have loved to film there, it's prohibited. You can't, not even, no one has gotten in there yet.
Got it. Well, I just only have one more question left. So this is another one from Alex that he's asked me to read. I'm kind of going to reframe it. So especially since you came from a journalism background, he'd love for you to talk about sort of any other docs that you drew inspiration from or might have watched, kind of building up to this project that sort of shaped your understanding of how you wanted to approach it.
I can't point to any one doc, but I certainly over the last several years have, watched many docs. And there's not one that I can point to. There's that I drew inspiration from. Sorry, I keep dodging the hard, or I'm
It's okay.
unable to answer the hard questions. But yeah, I mean, I worked with an edit team where we all kind of had our own reference points, and they would come up in conversation for specific scenes or moments. But I can't think of like, this is what I wanted to emulate. And it's not because there's not a lot of movies that I love. It's just, there wasn't one that was an obvious kind of kickoff for me.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So they did ask about Cartel Land specifically, I guess, because of the obvious.
Yeah. So there was not, I think we had a very different film. I respected Cartel Land to the point where I hired the producer for that. Miles Esty, who was the producer for Cartel Land, was in the field with me for much of this. So there was overlap, but I think that was largely because he was based in Mexico and is a great producer. I love that film. I think it was great, but it's not, I think it's very different than what we were doing.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that's all I have, and we're kind of at the end of our rope here. But I really enjoyed talking to you tonight, and I really enjoyed
me too.
the documentary.
Thanks, and I'm really honored that you guys all took time to watch and hang out to talk. So thanks for doing that.
Anything that our audience can do to help promote the film more? Is it still streaming on Showtime, maybe?
It is. I think it's there for good. I hope. It seems like they're still even airing it, on their regular linear broadcast, and it's streaming. And so yeah, if you can tweet it out, if whether you liked it or not, if you have any thoughts about it, if you want to engage with me, you can. I'm happy to, if you can send my email out. I'm happy to, I'd love to hear from people. I didn't get to do real life, screenings and talkbacks because of this thing that we're all going through. But this has been really fun. It's really fun for me to be able to engage with an audience. So feel free to pass along my email if anyone wants to hit me up.
Well, no, I am glad we can still do this. I really missed the in-person experience, but it is nice. Where are you calling from right now? Are you in LA?
I'm in Brooklyn right now.
See, that's what's great. We get to have this conversation from across coast. So
yeah, that's the good part. And yeah, I'm sure the weather, like I've got a pile of snow out my window right now. I'm sure you guys are all living it up.
Yeah, I have a bunch of colleagues in Wisconsin. I don't talk to them about the weather anymore. They get too upset.
Don't.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for being here.
Really thanks, guys.
Chatting with you, and good luck with the next project. Look forward to hearing.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Take care, guys.